few of you still looking for seats. There are a few up here in the front and a couple in this section to my right. I'd like to welcome up Maureen Hurton, Director of the Capital Area District Library, and Dwayne Stroney, Associate Director of Library and Instructional Support, and also a professor here at Cooley Law School. Please welcome them.
I'm actually the new director of the Capital Area District Library. 2 weeks now I have been director of the Capital Area District Library. So we are very thrilled to be part of this. The Capital Area District Library is always excited about the Great Michigan Reads. It's one of our most popular programs, and we've done a couple of programs ourselves leading up to this. We've done the program with MSU Jazz Ensemble. Was 2 weeks ago. We did a performance of 20s and 30s jazz, and we also did a program last week. It was called The Cartography of Race. It was with Matthew Daly, who's a professor at Grand Valley State University. We have 13 libraries, and in our 13 libraries, they're all partners with Great Michigan Reads. We have book discussions going on. We have, in each one of our libraries, we have posters, and we have displays, and we have every single one of our libraries, all 13 of them, are trying to promote this as best they can. And one of our libraries, the Foster Library here in Lansing, did a book discussion a year ago about this book, before it was even selected for the Great Michigan Read. So that tells you something, how important this book is. You know, they don't pick everything, they want to have it. So that was a really good telling thing that we had, that library wanted to do that. I wanted to tell you that we have lots of books in circulation for this book. We've certainly done our part. We got a number of copies for our book discussions from the Michigan Humanities Council. Also, we purchased some. We have some catalog. When I left the library today, we still had 44 people waiting for copies of this book, and I happen to have one of them out myself, so I'm going to try to return it and make the line a little shorter. I'll try to do that in the next couple of days. So anyway, I just wanted to thank the Michigan Humanities Council for including us and inviting us to do this, and I wanted to thank Cooley for this wonderful venue and co-sponsoring with us. But there's one little thing I also want to tell you that I found out that I thought would be really interesting that relates to the book before I leave. Our board chair, Marge Bosenberry, who is here tonight, who works for the State Bar, by the way, told me about this. It's called the Legal Milestones Program. I don't know if any of you know about it, but all over the state, they're recognizing different legal milestones, if you will, in the history of Michigan. And the very first one they did when they began this program in 1986 was the Ossian Sweet Trial. So there is a plaque in the Frank Murphy Hall of Justice in Detroit that commemorates this trial. So if you get down there, you ought to take a look at that. So, and again, thank you very much for coming tonight. I hope you all enjoy the performance.
Good evening. I just want to take a few moments to welcome you here to Cooley Law School. It's always nice when we have an author touring that stopped at the law school. A lot of times people look at a law school and say, what's the connection between an author tour and between the law school? And I said, well, depends on what the book is. Now, fortunately, I've been able to serve on the Michigan Notable Books selection committee for a number of years, and both of the author we're featuring tonight and his interviewer have been selected as notable books over the past few years as well. So I think I always appreciate that opportunity. I'm going to mention one bit of programming that we have going on that's indirectly related to this, but I think is worth noting as well for people at least in the Lansing area. Beginning tomorrow, we are hosting an American Library Association traveling tour entitled Lincoln, the Constitution, and the Civil War. And that will be located in the first floor of our library building, which is at the corner of Kalamazoo and Washington. And you're all invited to attend and take a look at that traveling exhibition. So that is, it's kind of ironic that at the same time we were sponsoring this event, that we knew that the tour was coming on the kind of tail end of it. And we hope that a number of you are able to stop by and take a look at that as well in the next few weeks. It's going to be through November 23rd. So without further ado, I'm going to say thank you for coming. I appreciate your attendance. We love having the community come out, and especially when we can offer such exciting entertainment as this evening, discussing such an interesting and relevant topic. Thank you.
Well, the council would like to thank the Capital Area District Library and Cooley Law School for being such excellent hosts for this program in Lansing. You know, we have this awful name, the Michigan Humanities Council. Could you be cursed with something that is more vague, as I had one woman in Grand Rapids ask me when I wanted her to join it. She said, "What does it deal with, social diseases?" So we have this awkward name, council, which sounds like we're a bunch of puffed up people sitting in judgment on others, and to a certain extent we are. I mean, we do give out money, and some get it and some don't. We hand out money for public programs in the humanities all across the state. We encourage programs that get people in Michigan talking to each other about where they live, who they are, what they value, and what their relationships are with each other. And in this day and age and these times, I'm hard-pressed to think of something that's more important for Michigan to do. So I believe in this program, and I believe in the work of the council, and I hope that at the end of this day, you'll have a better understanding of what the Michigan Humanities Council is and does. There are displays here in this room. Afterwards, please go up if you want to learn more about our work and help us in our work. We'd love to have you. We're here to talk to Kevin Boyle, who is the author of this year's Great Michigan Read. The Great Michigan Read is a program of the Humanities Council, started a few years ago with very low-hanging fruit, Ernest Hemingway's Nick Adams stories. It was popular. It was an instant success. We went on to offer Bittman Gwynn's Stealing Buddha's Dinner, set in Grand Rapids, as our second book, and our third book is The Arc of Justice, a saga of race, civil rights, and murder in the Jazz Age. Our sponsor for this program is Meyer, and I'm here to tell you that the Meyer family is almost in love with Kevin. They admire this book a lot, and I also understand that they admire the degree to which he's in debt to their stores, because he shops at them regularly. We also have support from the National Endowment for the Humanities tonight. Your tax dollars at work, I think, in a very good way. This book fascinated me. I grew up in Detroit on the east side and live in Grand Rapids now, and I thought, what the hell is going on with this? Why didn't I learn about this? I went to a good high school, I thought, and studied at the University of Michigan, majored in history. Took a lot of courses in Michigan history, and this was something on the periphery of my studies. I kept putting this book down in astonishment, asking myself, where has it been? And then thanking Kevin Boyle for putting it in front of us, and now realizing we have an excellent book in this state to talk about unpleasant truths. And it does so in an authoritative way and in a way that engenders discussion. And these discussions, surprising even to us, are happening all over this state. We are now in our third printing of the book. Not something that we anticipated. There are, as of yesterday, 269 public programs happening across our state in virtually every county in the Upper Peninsula and the Lower Peninsula, from Grosse Pointe to Calumet in the north. This book has captured people's imaginations. It has captured them in the sense of timeliness. And I want to thank the many scholars and writers and professors and compulsive readers across our state who sat in committee meeting after committee meeting at 5 of our state's largest libraries in each of the 5 quadrants of our state. They argued and read and read and read and finally distilled it down and said, this is the book that all Michiganders should read and discuss. Its author, Kevin Boyle, is born in Detroit. He attended University of Detroit, now University of Detroit Mercy. He received his doctorate from the University of Michigan, and I don't know why this is so important to me, other than it binds the two of us, but we both studied under Professor Sidney Fine, the eminent historian there. He is now gone over to the dark side and is a professor of history at Ohio State. But you have to look at it from the other side of the coin. Isn't it fascinating that Ohio has to import people from Michigan in order to teach the humanities? The Arc of Justice won the National Book Award in 2004, and it was the Michigan Notable Book in 2005, a finalist from the Pulitzer Prize. It was supported by grants from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Fulbright Commission, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Its author is witty and wise and insightful, and we're so lucky to have him here. He will be drawn out in discussion by the Honorable Judge William C. Whitbeck of the Michigan Court of Appeals, who I understand has several softballs and hardballs for Kevin Boyle. Please welcome our speaker, Dr. Boyle. I'm going to begin the presentation with a short film that the staff of the Humanities Council has created. I realize not all of you have completely read the book, so the film is not a spoiler. It'll just help set the tone for tonight's conversation.
Detroit, early 1900s. The city was growing rapidly. Immigrants flocked there to fill new jobs. They came from Europe and from across the United States. Thousands came from the South, white and black. Resentment grew against the large influx of migrants, with the white population changing its previous attitude toward black housing options.
Suddenly, what whites started to do was insist on a level of residential segregation they'd never insisted on before. They began to say African Americans can live in Black Bottom, that can be their neighborhood, but they can't live anywhere else.
Indicative of the changing mood, the membership of the Ku Klux Klan surged across the United States, including Michigan and Detroit. With a successful practice serving the black community, Dr. Ocean Sweet and his wife Gladys decided to move out of Black Bottom and purchase a decent home for their growing family, choosing a house in an all-white neighborhood. Being aware of the volatile atmosphere, Dr. Sweet asked his brother and several friends to help him protect his property, with guns if necessary. On the second night after moving in, a large crowd numbering in the hundreds formed on the street just outside the house. A dozen police were in place for protection, but did little.
It was terrifying because they knew how dangerous the situation was. It was terrifying because they knew what happened to black people in a situation like this. They knew where this could end up.
Suddenly, rocks started raining down on the house. Windows shattered. Then, shots from the house. Across the street, neighborhood resident Leon Briner lay dead. Police rushed in and arrested everyone in the house. The prosecutor charged all of them with first-degree murder.
Now this is a hopeless case. And the chances that they are going to have any chance in this courtroom are infinitesimal.
The NAACP quickly became involved in the case, hiring the nation's foremost defense lawyer, Clarence Darrow. Darrow very carefully selected a jury of white men and remarkably achieved first a hung jury, then acquittal. A victory in the case momentarily provided comfort to the Sweets, but Detroit's difficulties with housing segregation would only become more problematic in the decades ahead.
To find out more about the Great Michigan Read and Kevin Boyle's Arc of Justice, please visit MichiganHumanities.org. Produced by Michigan Productions with support from the Michigan Humanities Council and the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Before we get started, if I could just really quickly say thank you to the Michigan Humanities Council for both choosing the book, which is a tremendous honor, and for planning this tour. It's just been a great experience. You have no idea how much work has gone into this that they've done. So I just want to thank the council, and I want to thank Cooley Law School for hosting this, and I'd like to thank all of you for coming out tonight. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. I just have one really quick thing I want to say. There was a little reception over the state capitol before tonight's event, and I got a chance to meet a woman by the name of Catherine Dove Noren, and I don't think she's here, but the reason that I bring it up is that Catherine Dove then was 1 year old when the Sweet case happened, and her parents lived directly across the street from the Sweet's house. And they'll get mentioned probably tonight, I suspect. So there's nothing more exciting as an historian than to have that kind of personal connection to something that you spent a long time with. I do kind of wish I had met her a few years ago. I'm all yours.
Thank you. And can you all hear?
Yes.
Back? Good. This mic is sensitive, but I'll try to keep my voice up. And Kevin is wired up as well, so I hope you'll be able to hear us. Also, my thanks to the Michigan Humanities Council, the Capital Area District Libraries, and to Cooley Law School. It's really a good thing that the law school engages in these kind of events, these kind of community activities. When I was in law school, the division between the University of Michigan and everybody else in the town of Ann Arbor was rather severe. I don't think I ever saw real citizens of Ann Arbor when I was in law school. Let me start, Kevin, by asking kind of a softball question, frankly, one that authors often receive, but I'll narrow it down a little. How did you choose to write this book? And let me narrow it down by asking,
Sure.
How did you choose to write this book, Arc of Justice, as compared to something else that you might have written? What brought you to this particular book?
That's a great question. Really, this book started for me, the foundation of this book for me was a question. A really very straightforward question that came out of my teaching. I teach, and by the way, you are a very polite crowd. Usually the Ohio State thing was way worse. I teach history at Ohio State, teach American history, and I have on and off taught a course on the civil rights movement. And one of the things that I did in that course, the first time I taught it, was I followed what I think is the story of civil rights that most of us know. If you ask most people, when did the civil rights movement start in America? What they're going to tell you, if they say anything at all, is they're going to say it started on a Thursday night. December 1st, 1955, when Mrs. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. And then what they're going to tell you is they're going to tell you that that single act of defiance. You know what Mrs. Parks said on the bus that night? She said no. That's what she said. That single act of defiance then sparked a social movement that swept across the South in the 50s and 60s. And you could tell the steps it took. It went into the hallway of Little Rock Central High School in 1957. Sat down at the lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960. Rode the bus into Anniston, Alabama in 1961. It enrolled at the University of Mississippi in 1962. Filled the streets of Birmingham, Alabama with children. In the spring of '63, it marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge outside of Selma, Alabama in 1965, and it died in an afternoon in April of 1968 on a motel balcony in Memphis, Tennessee. And that's the story of civil rights, as most Americans know it. And that's the story when I taught this class for the very first time I taught. And then afterwards, I started to think to myself, so what is that story anyways? What's the essence of that story that most of us think of as civil rights? This is what it is. White Americans, and particularly white Southerners, embraced the sin of racism. African Americans walked into the face of that sin. They took that sin on their shoulders. They suffered for that sin. They died for that sin. And by that blood sacrifice, they redeemed the soul of America. That the standard story of civil rights in America is, in other words, the Christian story of redemption. Here's the question. What I ask myself is, what happens if you look at a civil rights moment that isn't in the South, that isn't in the 1950s and 60s, that doesn't fit the standard story? What happens to that story of civil rights then? Does it become less redemptive? That's the question that underlay this book.
In writing the book, Kevin, and I'm going to open up phrase and read a little, which was in the movie clip, but what struck me about it in reading it was A, how good the history was, but B, how good the writing was.
Oh, thank you.
And I'll give you just an example. This is in the opening chapter. More than a decade had passed since Henry Ford, desperate to keep his workers on the line, doubled their wages in an unprecedented $5 a day. Word of Detroit's high-paying jobs had shot through Pennsylvania mining towns, British shipyards, Mississippi farmhouses, and peasant villages from Sonora to Abruzzi. Tens of thousands of working people poured into the city, lining up at the factory gates, looking for their share of the machinist's and mechanic's dream. 11 years on, they were still looking and still coming. In 1900, when Ford was first organizing his company, Detroit had 285,000 people living within its city limits. By 1925, it had 1.25 million people. Only New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia were bigger. And Detroit was rapidly closing the gap. Detroit is El Dorado, wrote an awed magazine reporter. It is staccato America. It is shockingly dynamic. Now, that's a good quote, but that's also good writing. How did you...
This is fun.
How did you get this sense of Detroit? I mean, all of us, I think, can get a sense of Detroit now.
Yeah.
How did you get the sense of Detroit then?
That's really an interesting question. I've spoken to a couple of you in the audience tonight. I was born and raised in Detroit. And if you see Detroit, if you can look past the devastation of Detroit, and I think it is, in many ways, a devastated city now. But if you can look past that, what you can see is the imprint of that city. And it's in some of those fabulous websites you can go to about the ruins of Detroit. That's that city. I know it does take a kind of leap of imagination, but you go through the city of Detroit, you drive down Jefferson Avenue, Gratiot. There's a Detroit pronunciation for you if you ever heard of Gratiot. Yeah. Well, that's the west side. I don't go over there. That what you see is this amazingly dynamic city. I mean, those numbers, I'll give you just one specific kind of comparison. 1900, Detroit was the 15th largest city in America. I live in the 15th largest city in America today, Columbus. That tells you how far they went in those 20 years. It's the greatest boom town in the Western world. And you can see the imprint of that everywhere in that city today.
In that city, and I lived in Detroit shortly after the 1967 riots. I was there for 2.5 years, 3 years. In that city, as it existed then, as the film mentioned and as you emphasize in your book, Detroit was tightly segregated. Perhaps not by law, although there were certainly things on books and restrictions and deeds and that sort of thing, but what we would call more de facto segregation, enforced by custom and often by violence. But in that city, on the east side, there was Black Bottom.
Yes.
And next to that, sort of Paradise Valley, which I understand to have really been the entertainment district,
Right,
not
that's
so
right.
much the residential district. And all the rest of Detroit was white, basically.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
That is the $10 million question of the book. That what I tried to capture in the book is exactly the moment where the color line is drawn. That's what happens in Detroit in the 1920s, in the early 20s. Now, I'm not trying to claim that Detroit was ever a center of racial justice, because it wasn't. But it also wasn't really strictly segregated prior to the 1920s. There was this black neighborhood, the traditional black neighborhood in Detroit was called Black Bottom, and it ran right along the east side of downtown. So do any of you, I'll ask two questions. Any of you Detroiters originally? It's not too many. Do any of you ever go to Detroit? Okay, good. That's much better.
Go to Detroit twice.
So if you're driving into Detroit, downtown, you're coming in downtown down the freeway, if you come down the Chrysler, that's Black Bottom, because they built the freeway on top of it in the 50s. Now, the thing is that Black Bottom was a black neighborhood at the turn of the century, in the same way that Hamtramck was a Polish neighborhood, or Poletown was a Polish neighborhood, or Corktown was an Irish neighborhood. And what that meant in the 19th and early 20th century is about half the people who lived in those neighborhoods were of that particular group, and the other half weren't. But if you got a neighborhood that's half Polish, it feels really Polish. And that's what Black Bottom was. It was a poor neighborhood. Half the people who lived there were black, half the people who lived there were white. They lived side by side, nobody cared. And if you were a well-to-do African American, if you were, I don't know, let's pick a profession, a doctor, you didn't live in Black Bottom. You lived in all white neighborhoods. I know that. There were only 19 black doctors in Detroit in the early 20s. I just looked up where they lived. The vast majority of them lived in white neighborhoods. And nobody cared. But what happened in Detroit is tied with that great boom town. Because as this city expanded, it filled with people from all over the world. But it also filled with a huge migration of African Americans coming out of the South. And they're all coming for the same reason. You may know nothing about the United States in 1920. You know two words: Henry Ford. So people came for jobs. Detroit, 1910, had a black population of 5,700 people. That's nothing. 1920, it had a black population of 40,000. By 1925, it had a black population of almost 80,000. And so what happened is that migration came up to Detroit. All of a sudden, whites started saying stuff they hadn't been saying before. They started to say, we don't want black people sitting next to us in a movie theater. They hadn't really done that much before. They don't want black people next to them in a restaurant. Most important thing is they didn't want black people living next door to them. And they had never said that before. Now, this is not a hard thing to explain. One of the things you do when you're a professional historian is you take simple things and you make them really hard, because that way you impress your students. This is not hard. This is a rising tide of racism. It's really easy not to be racist when there are no black people around. It is different when you have a big black population. So all of a sudden, kind of, the rubber hits the road. And so what happened were people started to make this demand. Like I said in the film, you could live down in Black Bottom, that could be the black neighborhood, can't live anywhere else. Now, I just want to make it a little more complicated. Because this is the tricky part. The thing is, you can't segregate a city by racism alone. You can't. For a really simple reason. Not every white person in the 1920s was a racist. So, let's say you look like a very nice person. No, you don't look at him. I was talking about you. No, him, I wasn't so sure about him. Well, let's just say you are. But just for argument's sake, you and I are neighbors. African American moves into my neighborhood, and I say, I don't want a black person in my neighborhood. You could care less. All things being equal, I can't force my racism on you. I can't. I need help. And that's what happened in Detroit in the 20s. I got help. What happened in you can see it. They wrote it down, historian's dream. 1923, Detroit Realtors Association wrote into its rule book that if an African American wants to see a house in a white neighborhood, a realtor cannot show it to him. Wasn't there in 22, wasn't there in 21, it's there in 23. All of a sudden, the big downtown banks said if an African American wants to buy a house in a white neighborhood, won't have a mortgage, can't have a mortgage. Insurance company said African American does buy a house in a white neighborhood, we won't insure it. And those big developers, as you mentioned, and there were a lot of big developers because it was a boom town, building all this new housing, particularly on the outskirts of the city. They started to put just a simple clause in the deeds of their houses saying this house can never be sold to a Negro or sometimes to a Jew. And what they did, in other words, is they took those forces of the real estate marketplace, they took this rising tide of racism and they codified it. They organized it. And that's how you segregate a city.
Would you say then that that's what sets Detroit apart from, say, Chicago and the South Side?
Wonderful
New York
question.
And Harlem? Is that what makes Detroit different?
No, that's a wonderful question. Not in the least. What happened in Detroit happened in every major American city in the 1920s. Sometimes it happened earlier. Chicago actually embraced this in the 1910s, particularly the restrictive covenants. That was if you look in Detroit deeds, and you probably have been doing this yourselves. Yeah, I thought I saw you there. Well, I have. If you look in Detroit deeds, they really almost never have restrictive covenants in the 1910s. It's really in the early 20s, the late teens and early 20s. Chicago's about 10 years earlier. Every city does this. What makes Detroit distinctive, to the extent that it is distinctive, is that it's happening, as we were just talking about, in a boom town. So it's in a place where, what happens to real estate values in a boom town? They go through the roof. And so the stakes of this kind of manipulation of the real estate market are intensely high because people are mortgaged up here because it's the only way you can buy a house in the city. And so Detroit's not distinctive in the process at all. It's distinctive in its intensity of the process.
And in that milieu, in that environment, how did you learn about the story of Dr. Ocean Sweet?
I swear I am going to come up with a good story about that, because it's just, the real story is so boring. Basically, I knew this. I mean, if you grew up in Detroit, at some point or another, there was a chance. I'm not saying everybody did, but growing up, there's a chance you heard about this. It would show up, it would be a 10-year anniversary. It's the 50th anniversary, the 60th anniversary, and some story would show up in the newspapers, or they mentioned it in your Michigan history class, in grade school. Well, that didn't happen too often, at least not in my grade school. But, there was somewhere along the line you stumbled across it. So I knew this story. The only real difference was I didn't know 300 pages of it. And the key was I came to realize lots and lots of people didn't know the story, and I thought it was worth telling.
You tell the story in a narrative fashion, virtually a chronological fashion, and like a good novel, it has an arc, forgive the pun, which ends with the Sweet trial, or the trials rather, and then a denouement, which I won't go into, and I'll let you, if you like, read the book to figure out what the twist at the end is. Did you see it that way, as a novelistic form, although it's clearly historical fact, but you tell it more in the style of a storyteller, to be honest?
Well, I'll give you a two-part answer to that. Yes, I wanted to tell a story. And it was a lesson that I've learned from teaching. I have most of my career as a teacher taught very big classes, especially the undergraduate classes. And if you teach a really big class of freshmen, say at a university, and you get up in front of a class to talk about some big subject, and you don't hook people into that story in the first 5 minutes, you're in big trouble. And that was even before texting came in. And so the idea of telling stories is a way of drawing people into history. We love stories. I love stories. And so storytelling seemed like a very natural way for me to do this. It was a lesson of teaching. I do have one other thing I'll tell you. I've never actually told anybody, an audience, this before. I wrote this book for my father. And what I mean by that is my father is a voracious reader. He has always loved to read. And he's a very, very smart man. But my father has his high school diploma. He didn't go to college. And if I had written this in an academic form, he would have had a hard time climbing into the book. And I wanted to write a book that my father wanted to read.
Looking at it now from the vantage point of almost 90 years later, it's hard for us, I think, to understand why it might have motivated Dr. Sweet and his wife, who was, I guess the proper term, within the African American community, was something of a socialite, something of a social climber.
Oh, yeah.
Using that term pejoratively, but and Dr. Sweet obviously was an educated man. Wilberforce, Howard University, where he got his medical degree. What do you think, now 90 years later, caused him to get up one morning and say, I'm going to move to Garland Avenue in an all-white neighborhood with a Waterworks Improvement Association that is clearly anti-integration, with a police department that is certainly not out there protecting the rights of African Americans, and with the Ku Klux Klan having some 85,000 members in Michigan. What caused him to do that, to the extent that you can speculate on it?
Oh, I think I have a decent sense of that. And it's one of the things that I think makes this story, for me, particularly poignant. I think Dr. Sweet decided to buy that house on Garland Avenue. And I should just, as a quick aside, Garland Avenue sounds very grand. It sounds like they're on some giant boulevard somewhere. Garland Avenue is a side street. It's a tiny little side street. If you're driving down Garland Avenue, you're coming this way and a car's coming this way, you guys are in trouble. Because there's not really room for the two of you to pass, which is why nowadays Garland Avenue is actually a one-way street, but it wasn't in those days. So we're not talking about some really grand, fancy neighborhood. This is a very ordinary neighborhood. They buy the best house on the block. I don't know if this means anything in Lansing, so excuse me if it doesn't, but in Detroit, this is a big deal. They bought the brick house. All right, we're good. So the question, I think, is exactly the one to ask. What made him and Mrs. Sweet buy the house? What made them buy that house were all the things that make people buy houses. They bought that house because it had a nice backyard with a fence around it. And they had a little girl, they had a 2-year-old. And they thought the little girl would be safe playing in the backyard because it's got a nice fence around it. They bought that house because it's kitty corner to a grade school. And so when Eva, the baby, was ready to go to school, she could go to school right across the street. They bought that house. Mrs. Sweet, she says this at one point, I love this. She says, that house had one more room than my mother's house. Dr. Sweet bought that house because he was an incredibly proud man. This was a man who was the son of dirt poor farmers. His parents owned a 1/4 acre of land. Now, I'm not a farmer. I never saw a cow till I was 20. I thought they came in little packages in the grocery store. But even I know a 1/4 acre of land is not a lot of land. His grandparents were born in slavery, and he's a medical doctor. He was a very proud man. This is the great American dream. So he was very proud that he could buy the brick house. And then, by the way, when he moved into that neighborhood, he was of a higher status economically than anyone else in that neighborhood. Because this was a working class, kind of an upper end of the working class neighborhood. They bought that house because if you look at the map in the handout that Michigan Humanities Council did, which is a great map, it's 1 mile, just about 1 mile straight south of her parents' house. Mrs. Sweet grew up in a completely white neighborhood. She's African American, but she grew up in a completely white neighborhood because that system of segregation hadn't been in place yet. Now, house is exactly 1 mile from your parents' house. Why do you do that? Yeah, because they're far enough away they can't just stop by, and they're close enough that when you need a babysitter, you can drop the baby off. In other words, the point really is that they knew that was a risky thing to do. They weren't naive people, but they bought that house for all the reasons human beings buy houses. It was a completely simple human decision, which I think is a really important point. Because what we have a tendency to do when we think about civil rights activists is we tend to, for all the right reasons, put them up on a pedestal. They're not human beings anymore. They are Mrs. Rosa Parks. They are Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, these are great people. I'm not trying to deny that, but they're also human beings. People do things, incredibly brave things sometimes, for the most ordinary of reasons. That's not to take away from their courage. If you ask me, it heightens it. Because all of a sudden, they're not superhuman. They're a lot like us. And I think that's a really exciting thing.
So the Sweets moved in
Sweets moved in.
into a very charged atmosphere.
They did.
And it wasn't long before the mob began to gather outside their home. What happened?
They found this house in June of 1925. They made an agreement with the owners to buy the house in June of 1925. They were supposed to move in on the 1st of August, 1925. But Dr. Sweet, as I said, he understood, believe me, he understood, and I'm happy to talk more about that when we come to the discussion part if anyone's interested. He understood this was a very dangerous thing to do. And so what he did in the summer of 1925 is he made arrangements to protect himself when he moved in. The first thing he did was he shifted the move-in date back from that August 1st day to September 8th. And he picked September 8th because that was the day after Labor Day. And those of you who are old enough in the room, you know what used to happen, day after Labor Day, right? Still does here? Yeah, because the Northern Michigan insisted that the tourist trade keep going through Labor Day. Well, in my state, it doesn't happen anymore. Kids go back to school. Why is that important? Because that means they picked the day where they were sure the teenagers were going to be off the street. And he asked for police protection, but the police department was a major center of Ku Klux Klan activity in the 20s. Couldn't trust the police department. So Dr. Sweet arranged his own defense. He had two brothers who were in Detroit that summer. One had moved there, he was a dentist. The other one was going to school down in Ohio and had come up to work for the summer. So he asked his brothers if they would come in with him and his wife to be in the house first couple nights to protect it. They didn't bring in the baby. They left the baby with her parents, because you don't take chances with your baby. They got a group of their friends together, and all together they got 11 African Americans to come into the house first couple nights in case there was trouble. But 11 African Americans sitting in a house, it's nice, but it's not going to really do much. So all through August, what Dr. Sweet did is he gathered together this huge cache of weapons. 10 rifles, pistols, shotguns, hundreds of rounds of ammunition. On move-in day, September 8th, they put them in big bags. They walked right inside the house with them. And they went up the stairs, and I've been in the house, and it's a corner house, which is important. And they put the guns upstairs in the hallway. There's this great built-in linen closet. And they put the guns in there, and they waited for nightfall, and they waited for that mob to come. And it came. About 7:30, 8 o'clock that night, they looked outside. The police were there, out on the sidewalk. And again, it's a really tight neighborhood, so we're not talking really far away to be on the sidewalk. It's not like there's this giant palatial front lawn out there. Police are out on the sidewalk, and the sidewalk from the front door is probably about, maybe row 5 out there. And just beyond that, hundreds of white people on two sides, because it's on the corner. And so the men raced upstairs, and they opened up the linen closet, and they took out the guns, and they went to the upstairs window, and they put chairs at the upstairs window, and they sat there with the guns in their laps, and they waited for that mob to attack. and nothing happened. They sat there all evening till sometime around midnight, and I have no clue exactly what happened out on that street, but I got a good guess. About midnight, somebody out in that crowd took a look at his watch and said, "Oh man, I got to go to work in the morning." And they went home. But imagine you were sitting at that upstairs window. And if that mob had charged, they would have been on that front porch in 30 seconds. So you don't just say, "Well, I guess that's over, we'll go to bed too." Just think of how much adrenaline is pumping through your veins at midnight. Mrs. Sweet couldn't sleep at all that night, walked through the house all night. Next day, they tried to act like everything was normal. Dr. Sweet went down to his practice, down in Black Bottom. Mrs. Sweet went out and bought furniture because she had a brand new house with one more room than her mother's house. And she had no furniture. Then about 5:30, 6 o'clock that night, the African Americans, at 11 people, came back into the house one by one for the second night. And Dr. Sweet, he set up one of those folding card tables. He had one of those and he set it up in the dining room. And the men sat around playing cards so they could take their minds off things. And Mrs. Sweet, you know what Mrs. Sweet was doing, right? Of course, she's in the kitchen. She's got 10 people now. She's got to feed them all. She's in the kitchen cooking them dinner. Ham, by the way. And then around 7:30, 8 o'clock, Dr. Sweet's younger brother, Henry, got up from the table and he went over to the front window and he looked out and the mob was back. About the same size as before, maybe bigger, no one's really sure. And so the men go upstairs and they open up that linen closet. It's all happening again. And Dr. Sweet, he reaches in and he grabs a handgun. And he wants to check to make sure that it's loaded. And so while he was checking to see if it was loaded, he realized that his hand was going like this. Because he'd been up half the night and he was tired and he was terrified. So he went into the front bedroom. And I've been in the bedroom, and it's because it's one of those Detroit bungalows, the ceiling slopes down. It's a really small room, and it feels very claustrophobic. And he lay down on the bed to comfort his nerves. Took his shoes off so he wouldn't mess up the sheets. And he lay there about 20 minutes, maybe 15, 20 minutes. And then one little thing happened out on the street, and as you saw in the film, the crowd started to throw stones at the house. And they hit on that great Detroit front porch, you know. And it hit on the front porch, and they hit on the ceiling, and two of them, and if you saw the picture of the house, which was taken right after the incident, you can see in the upstairs window, two of them go through the upstairs window. You know what it's like when you hear glass shattering? You just flinch. And the minute that happened, the men inside opened fire. And they hit two members of the mob. One was a young man who had come home from work. He was renting a room at the Dove's house, straight across the street from the Sweets. And he was renting a room, and he had come home from work, and he was up in the bathroom cleaning himself up. He was a plumber's apprentice, so he was cleaning himself up. And if any of you live in kind of city neighborhoods, you'll get this part. So his little boy, the landlord's little boy, comes racing up into the bathroom and says, "They're throwing stones at the Negro's house. You got to see this. You got to see this." And if you're a city person, you know, you got to see this. You always do that. I remember that as a kid. "Oh, look, there's a fire. Let's go watch." So he ran down the stairs and he opened up the front door, comes out on the porch, and he got shot right there. The other man was a man by the name of Leon Briner. He lived down the block. His house was about halfway down the block, but it's a really, really long block. And he had been out on the porch, sitting out on the porch in a rocking chair with his wife, but he couldn't see anything because it was too far away. And so he'd come down the block just to kind of scope things out. And he was standing on the Dove's front yard. He had his back turned to the Sweets house. He was talking with the people out on the porch, including Catherine Dove, the little baby sitting on the front porch. And he got shot once in the back. And it went through him. Went straight through him. And it killed him. Died right there on the Dove's front yard. And that's when the police actually rushed into action. They went inside the Sweets house, as you saw in the film, and they arrested all 11 African Americans. Dr. Sweet, Mrs. Sweet, both brothers, all their friends, and within a day and a half had charged every single one of them with first-degree murder. That's the event that's the center of this book.
My own experience with mobs, and I've only had one, was years ago in Warren when Governor Romney was pushing fair housing. And
That would do it.
Circling the courthouse was a mob, frankly. George Romney, being who he was, managed to get out of the car. I was quaking in my boots, and he started shaking hands with them, a born politician. But as the night went on,
His son should go into politics.
as the night wore on, I was in and out of the courthouse. I noted one thing. They were getting more and more drunk. Liquor was what was being passed around, either directly or indirectly. Was that a factor? And if it was, how did the police get them out? If you've got a mob, it's late at night, it's hot.
Yeah, it's very hot night.
How do they get them out?
That's a great. I do not know whether they were drinking. I wouldn't be surprised if they were drinking. I mean, it was Detroit. So there's a good chance, but I don't know that. Getting them out was the terrifying thing. Dr. Sweet begged the police not to take them out the front door, because what he had seen. I'll give you one quick bit of background. Dr. Sweet grew up in a little town in Florida, tiny little town in Florida called Bartow, ordinary place. When he was a young man, he was a child. 5 times in that town, whites lynched black men. 5 times. Worst of those incidents, when Dr. Sweet, when Ocean Sweet, was 5 years old, the white people of Bartow burned a 16-year-old boy to death at the stake. So he knew what a mob could do. And all he could see was the police leading him out into that mob. So they sat in the house and he begged them, pull the drapes, don't take us out the front door. And the police, remarkably really, agreed to that. And so what they did is there's an alley out the back. And because it's a corner house, which probably made all the difference in the world because you didn't have to actually come down the alley, they pulled the paddy wagon into the alley, just the front of the alley, and loaded all 11 people into the back of that paddy wagon. And the mob surrounded it. And one policeman came out with his gun drawn and told him to get the hell out of the way. I think that's the only reason they got out of that neighborhood that night.
So all 11 are arrested. The prosecutor, a man named Toms, who, by the way, much later in his life was one of the judges at the Nuremberg trials.
Yeah.
Interesting man.
Yeah. Met his family too, actually, afterwards.
And then appears on the scene one of the great figures in American legal history, Clarence Darrow.
Yeah.
Explain how that happened.
That's what you call the technical term for this. Blind luck. What happened really was that 2 days after the Sweets were arrested, one of the New York City newspapers ran a tiny little article. It's a paragraph long, way in the back pages. The headline read, 11 Negroes arrested in Detroit. And I will guarantee you 99% of the readers of that newspaper that day didn't notice it. One guy in the entire city of New York read that newspaper article. And he's one of the towering figures of American civil rights history, and most people have never heard of him. His name is James Weldon Johnson. And he was the head of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And what he said when he read that article is he said, "We will defend the Sweets." And that's the first great stroke of luck. Now, they decided, the NAACP decided right off the bat, in those days, the NAACP did not have its own lawyers. Now it has one of the great legal teams and has for the last half century, because of the Sweet case, actually. Sweet case created the Legal Defense Fund for the NAACP. They didn't have that then. So they would hire lawyers to do their legal work for them, or better, get them to do it pro bono. That didn't work all that often. And so they set out to get a white lawyer. They wanted a white lawyer because they knew that the jury was going to be all white. And you didn't want the black lawyer arguing in a Detroit court for his black clients on their right to kill a white guy. They couldn't get one. 3 weeks to trial, they had no lawyer. No one wanted this case. Then that guy you mentioned said he'd do it. Clarence Darrow, arguably the greatest criminal defense lawyer of the 20th century, took on this case. Now, just a real quick background. Clarence Darrow, if you don't know his story completely, Clarence Darrow had made an entire career defending people other people really wouldn't want as neighbors. first great stage of his legal career, and he was at the end of his career by this point, was defending one of those, really one of the more popular groups in American society, radical labor leaders. So his first great client was a guy by the name of Eugene Victor Debs. Yeah, you've heard of him. 5-time candidate for the President of the United States on the Socialist Party ticket. Last time he ran was from a federal prison. He did. In prison for speaking out against a war. Can't imagine such a thing. One of his greatest clients was a fellow by the name of Big Bill Haywood. He was the president of a little organization called the Industrial Workers of the World, the most radical union in American history. He was accused of murdering the former governor of Idaho. He defended 2 labor leaders called they were the McNamara brothers, who had been accused of mass murder. They were accused of setting a bomb that went off at the Los Angeles Times building. Los Angeles Times was an infamous anti-union newspaper, and one day a bomb went off, killed a dozen people. And the McNamara brothers were accused of planting the bomb. Darrow represented them.
Did he kill
That one actually went really badly. Turned out the McNamara brothers had blown up Los Angeles. 1924, Clarence Darrow defended 2 young men accused really of the most heinous crime you can imagine. Their names were Leopold and Loeb, and they had murdered a child to see if they could get away with it. 1925, in the summer, he defended another young man accused of another heinous crime. His name was John Scopes. He had committed the terrible crime of teaching the idea of evolution in a high school science class. So encouraging to think we've at least eliminated that as an issue anymore. Arguably, the Scopes monkey trial is the most famous trial in the 20th century. The Sweet trial was Clarence Darrow's next case. In November of 1925, he came into a Detroit courtroom with this fellow sitting on the bench by the name of Frank Murphy and defended the Sweets and their friends on a charge of first-degree murder.
As an aside, when Clarence Darrow was arguing the Leopold and Loeb case, the question was really not whether they were going to be convicted. Matter of fact, they were convicted rather quickly. The question was, would they be put to death? And Illinois had capital punishment.
Right.
And of course, that question is tried not to a jury, but to a judge.
Yep.
And this was a seasoned judge, a crotchety old guy. By the time that Darrow finished his closing argument, the judge was in tears.
Yep.
He was that good a lawyer. Judges don't cry very often. He was that good a lawyer. So, Clarence Darrow, 3 weeks before trial, is presented with this case. What happens?
I don't think I'll tell you. Because I wrote this book. I got 2 kids. I got a sense of conscience. Let me tell you, I'll tell you one thing. So, Clarence Darrow didn't know much law. He had gone to the University of Michigan Law School. I just want to explain to y'all, though Cooley, you probably don't care really. That's in my contract. I have to tell that one joke. That's how I got tenure at Ohio State.
Poor man.
Honestly, Clarence Darrow didn't believe in the law. Clarence Darrow said the law is a sham. What Clarence Darrow believed in was the power of words. And his greatest gift as a lawyer, and I think Leopold and Loeb is a great example of this, was his closing statements. Because then he had the stage to himself. And when you read his autobiography, which he published in the 30s, and you cannot believe a word of, he says that his closing statement to the Sweets was the best closing statement he ever made. So, if you don't mind, which is why I actually have the book here besides the cheap pitch, I would love to, if you don't mind, and you're really stuck, really, so you don't have much choice. I thought I would read you his closing statement. It's 7 hours long. One person is applauding. Yeah. 3 a.m. I want to be home. No, what I'll do is I will read you the closing of his closing. Well, it's the last 3. I don't believe in the law of hate. I may not be true to my ideals always, but I believe in the law of love, and I believe you can do nothing with hatred. I would like to see a time when man loves his fellow man and forgets his color or his creed. We will never be civilized until that time comes. I know the Negro race has a long road to go. I believe the life of a Negro has been a life full of tragedy, of injustice, of oppression. The law has made him equal, but man has not. I know there's a long road ahead of him before he can take the place which I believe he should take. I know that before him there is suffering, tribulation, and death among the blacks, and perhaps among the whites. I'm sorry. I would do what I can to avert it. I would advise patience. I would advise toleration. I would advise understanding. I would advise all those things which are necessary for men to live together. And that's all. And the reason I love that is, you know what you hear there? What you hear in that segment is Clarence Darrow standing in front of 12 white men in that jury box and promising redemption. That what he's holding out to them is the promise that America's greatest divide, that color line, can be bridged with understanding, with tolerance, with the transformation of the human heart. That's what made him a great lawyer.
So one has to ask, knowing only a little of the answer, did redemption come?
No.
I was afraid that would be the answer.
Let me explain what I mean. The Southern system of segregation, the system of segregation that was created at exactly the time that Ocean Sweet was a boy, that system that said you had to sit in the back of the bus, you had to have separate drinking fountains, that they have 2 doors colored in white, that's gone. You don't need me to tell you that. It's dead and gone. It's destroyed by that social movement that I started talking about this evening. But the Northern system of segregation, that system of segregation that divides American cities, black and white, separate and unequal, that system of segregation is almost completely in place. And of all the cities in America, Detroit, Ocean Sweet's Detroit, is among the most segregated. But on one point, and this is the last thing I'll say, on one point, Clarence Darrow had it exactly right. That until that system of segregation is dead and gone, until the Northern system of segregation is destroyed, we are not a civilized people.
Kevin, and thank you all for being here tonight. We've set aside some time for questions from the audience. And I think that Dr. Boyle, being as fluent as he is in history and in English, will welcome any question that you might have.
Absolutely.
So long as it's stated in terms of a family audience.
That's right.
So I'm not exactly sure what the mechanics are here, and I'm not going to be the person calling on
I'll
people.
do it. Yes, sir.
Are there any repercussions for the jurors from the trial?
That's a wonderful question. No, I can just repeat the question because it might be easier for people. I have this mic. The question is, were there any repercussions for the jurors? Not that I have ever heard of, and not that anyone ever reported. No. That's a great question. Yes, ma'am.
In the movie, there were photos of the house and the crowd and so on. Were there real photos or were they reenactments?
In the clip, the house, that's the Sweets house. But no, there are the photos that crowd scene is superimposed on it. And if you look at the crowd scene, I shouldn't be pointing this out, I suppose, but if you look at the crowd scene, all those people are wearing winter coats. I mean, it was about 90 degrees, which is one of the things that happened, actually, that I think is an important part of the story, is you were talking about drinking in the crowd, and there may well have been. It was also just really hot. And in any urban area, when it's hot and people are out on the streets, emotions start to get really, really ragged. Yes, sir. Yes.
In writing his biography of Frank Murphy, did Professor Fine take any particular look at this incident and the contribution Frank Murphy made?
Yeah, and as the judge mentioned, Sidney Fine was my PhD advisor. And there are many things that Professor Fine taught me. One of the things he taught me was that when you do your research, you be as thorough as possible. So believe me, you want to read a very, very solid account of the Sweet case from the perspective of the trial judge. Sidney Fine's biography, you're never going to do any better. It's just written, because obviously it's a biography of Frank Murphy, it's written from the judge's perspective. I think Frank Murphy is just absolutely fascinating. One of the things that makes this such a great story to tell is that all these fascinating people pass through the story. Those of you who don't know Frank Murphy or know of Frank Murphy was a young, very ambitious politician who had just been elected to Detroit's criminal court, which is called used to be called Recorder's Court. From there, he was elected mayor of Detroit. He was elected governor of Michigan. He served somewhere around here. And then was appointed Attorney General of the United States, and then appointed to the United States Supreme Court. And while he was on the court, he was one of the great civil libertarians in the court's history. He writes 3 different times the court rules in the 1940s when Justice Murphy was on the bench, takes cases on the constitutionality of Japanese internment. And Frank Murphy writes The Great Dissent. The court upholds internment. And Frank Murphy writes The Dissent, and his line is something like, I think this is pretty close to exactly what he says, is he says that this policy stares into the ugly abyss of racism. Which, I can just imagine the United States Supreme Court saying today. And what you hear in that, I really honestly believe what you hear in that is the echo of the Sweets. Yes, ma'am.
Can you explain the title, Arc of Justice? Does it come from that famous quote?
It does indeed. There's a long story to that. I'll give you the medium version. I really, really struggled with the title of this book. It had bunches and bunches of titles while I was working on it, and they were terrible. And the book was getting almost done, and it didn't really have a good title. It didn't really have a title at all that we could put on it. And it turns out that Amazon hates that, untitled book. So we really needed one. My editor and I were getting really nervous about this, and I had given a talk, actually the one that got me hired at Ohio State, called, on the book, as I was working on it, called Arc of Justice. And it comes from this very famous quote that Martin Luther King made famous, but it's not actually his. It comes from an abolitionist by the name of Theodore Parker. And what Theodore Parker said is that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I love that. Now the problem is that giving a book a title is kind of like naming your children. So you and your wife are expecting, and you spend 8 months arguing about the name. I can't name him Jennifer. I had a kid in 3rd grade named Jennifer. I hated her. And then the child's born, and like 3 weeks later, you can't imagine they ever had another name. And that's kind of like titling a book. The problem with this title is that that's a very optimistic quote, that essentially what it says is it may take a long time, but there will be justice. This is not an optimistic book. And so in some ways, the title's wrong. And so what I did is, at the very start of the book, I put in the quote so people would know where it came from, and then I put beneath it a very short poem from Langston Hughes, the great poet of the Harlem Renaissance. And I'll read it to you, it's only 4 lines long. It says, that justice is a blind goddess, is a thing to which we blacks are wise. Her bandage hides 2 festering sores that once perhaps were eyes. And I put that there to counterbalance the optimism of that quote. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. I think I don't know if it was the book or one of the guys, you had been able to meet one of his younger brothers.
I did. I met his baby brother.
Did you meet other relatives?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. I will. The question is that you had read in one of the guides that the council prepared that I had met while I was working on the book, Dr. Sweet's baby brother. And yes, I did. I met his baby brother, Sherman Sweet. I should make clear, baby brother is a relational term. He was 89 when I met him. And I met him in his home in Bartow. He lives on the land that his parents bought in the late 1890s. The house is gone. They built a new house on it somewhere. It's a kind of ranch house they built on the land, but it's the same land that his parents bought, that 1/4 acre of land. And he had lived, in fact, most of his adult life in Cleveland. But I think either when his wife passed or maybe when they retired, they came back to Bartow. And I spent the afternoon with him, and it was an amazing experience. He was very, very generous with me, with his time and with his memories. So if you read the book, some of the early material on the family dynamics really comes from Mr. Sweet, who's very kind to me. I'll tell you the thing that I remember most is about halfway through our conversation. It took a little time. He was a little nervous talking to some guy he didn't know who showed up asking for some time, so understandably. But halfway through our conversation, once he was comfortable, I asked him, so what was the effect of this event on your brother? And he said to me, it destroyed him. Yes, ma'am, you had a question?
It was just what the woman just asked. I wonder if you had met any of the family members.
That was the only family member I had met at that point. I tried really hard to track down people, and it was a very hard thing to do. So there are 2, this is not your question, but this is such a cheap trick. I was just going to tell you something. You didn't ask, but I know this. I'm going to tell it to you. I think there are 2 big holes in the research. One is Gladys Sweet, who I tried desperately to find out more about. If you read the book, you know everything I know, because I just couldn't get any more. And the other were the Briners, the man who's killed. I desperately wanted more about the Briners. The problem was that when Mr. Briner was killed, he had 2 daughters, and they were teenagers at the time. And which means, of course, that by the time they reached their 20s or 30s, they're going to get married, they changed their names, and I couldn't track them. So I'll tell you just quickly, because you asked. So about 4 or 5 months after the book came out, I got a call at my office one day from this woman who lives in suburban Washington, D.C. And she told me that her husband was Leon Briner's grandson. And somebody, I don't know how really, I've never gotten that part of the story straight, somebody gave them a copy of the book. And there's a picture of Leon Briner in the book. And that was the first time he had ever seen his grandfather. Because this was not something they talked about. And so I was given a talk in Washington, D.C., I don't know, a couple months after that, and they came. And we sat down afterwards, and I talked with them for about an hour or so about their family history. And one of the really ironic things about the story is, of course, he wasn't doing anything. He got shot in the back. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And one of the ironies of the story is there's actually some decent parallels between the Briner family and the Sweet family. Mrs. Briner lost her husband, which meant she had no breadwinner in the family. And then when the Great Depression hit in 30 or 31, they lost the house. It was foreclosed, and they were forced to move out. They were thrown into poverty. She married again, but really, according to the family, I'm not projecting on them, really for the money, for the stability of finding a husband, unhappy marriage. But her daughters made sure their children got to college. So he, Mr. Briner, the man who well, he wasn't Mr. Briner, but the grandson who I met, he had retired by this point, but he had worked his entire career as an engineer. So here was a family on the other side of the color line who rises up from poverty through their hard work as well. And in a lot of ways, it's a very similar story with this one tragic intersection to it. This is a story about a lot of victims. Yes, ma'am?
You said that he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Was there a barrage of shots from the house?
Yeah, there's about 20 or 30 shots. No one counted them, and no one ever gathered. The police did a less than thorough job, because this is really a political trial. If you think about the basic argument they're making here, they don't know who shot the fatal shot, yet they're charging everybody. And by the way, in those days, Michigan did not have capital punishment, so this was life imprisonment. So it's not a strong case, but it's a political case. The prosecutor, Toms, is bringing this case because it's such a highly charged moment, and he's, of course, an elected official. So they just fire out, and again, what you have to do, and when I got a chance to go in the house, this made all the difference, because the people who live in the house invited me in. Obviously, I didn't break in. I'm just here sneaking in the back door of your house. And they let me wander everywhere. They were really incredibly generous to me. And they let me up into that front bedroom, and you stand at that window, and you realize what they were looking at. What you got to think of is the pure terror of that moment. So they don't know what they're doing inside the house either. People are just shooting out into the darkness. They're terrified. The people in the street hear these shots. They're terrified. It's chaos. And as you were saying, Judge, if you've ever been in any sort of mob scene, it is the most terrifying thing you ever read. The one I really remember personally was I happened to be at the game where the Tigers clinched the pennant in 1984. And out on that street, that was terrifying. After Michigan and Trumbull were overturning cars, and we've won the pennant, let's burn cars. It was terrifying. And of course, that has nothing to do, that's nowhere near this level. So what you really have to do, and it's one of the things that I think standing at that window really drove home to me, is you have to think about the human experience of being in that moment. This is not a rational act at this point for anybody.
Could you talk a little bit about the suites are abstract to their neighbors?
Oh yeah,
You just moved them in, they have
that is so right.
But you've got other times in Detroit where people are really getting rid of neighbors who have been living in the neighborhood for a while.
Yeah.
And so the difference between stopping someone who you've never met before versus suddenly turning on people who have been in your midst for some time.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, a point. That's the other thing that is really important to keep in mind here. Those people in that neighborhood, they didn't know who the Swedes were. They had no clue. All they knew is that they were not white people. No one came over and knocked on the door and said, allow me to introduce myself. I'm your neighbor. We'll be out in the street tonight. They were complete abstractions. But as I mentioned earlier, other African Americans, particularly if they were not poor, lived in white neighborhoods. And those people at this point were also starting to get, the threats shoved into their mailboxes, the kind of people throwing stuff at the house. So there's a lot of pressure that's coming to people who had actually been in white neighborhoods for a very long time. Now, this Mrs. Sweet, Gladys Mitchell was her name, her maiden name. They had none of that. They lived in a completely white neighborhood too, and they never reported anything like that. But you're absolutely right that at this point, it's about driving people out. And that is a really different dynamic. If you think about it, these are people you actually know, you might have lived next to for 10, 15 years. And all of a sudden, they're a contagion in your neighborhood. And that is a really different dynamic. That's a great point. Yes, sir?
Let me add one, or ask one in there, Kevin.
We'll get you.
I won't interrupt that. I mentioned the Klan, but what role did the Klan play in all of this?
That is a wonderful question. The Ku Klux Klan was enormously big in Detroit. In 1923, the Klan had a membership in the city of Detroit of 35,000 people. And I have pointed out to people, that's official membership. You got to join. You can't just say you're a Klansman. You got to join. There's a membership fee. You got to buy the right sheets. You can't go to your bedroom and say, oh, I'm a Klansman. You got to go buy the official sheets. I guess you could, but you'd be a fake Klansman. Who would want that? So that's 35,000 people who paid the dues. It was $6 for I'm not making this up. It was $6 for the official sheets. which was a ripoff, by the way. Yeah, it wasn't a good sheet. It wasn't like triple ply or anything. So the Klan was a very big presence in Detroit. 1923, in the mayoral election, the Klan put up a candidate. The Klan wasn't organized enough to actually get his name on the ballot. But they ran a Klan candidate. They ran him as a write-in candidate. He won by a write-in candidate. But this was Detroit. So what happened was the Electoral Commission found a way to throw out 15,000 votes and denied him the right to take office. But he won. So they're very, very powerful. But, and this is a really important caveat to that, people have said to me over the years, why don't you say that the Klan made that protest out on the street? And the reason's really simple. They didn't. And why that's important is that if that mob out on the street is a Klan mob, and it wasn't, but if it were, then all of a sudden this becomes a safe story. Because most of us couldn't ever imagine ourselves Klansmen. Those are crazy people, 35,000 of them in sheets, but still, those people are so marginal. What's terrifying about the Sweet story, and really more importantly about the entire dynamic of residential segregation, is the way that the system of segregation makes people who are good, ordinary people act in horrific ways. That's what's terrifying, not the Klan. It's what the system does to people who couldn't imagine themselves Klansmen. I'll just throw in one other thing. I was given a talk a long, long time ago at a book group. I went to a book group in Columbus, and it was in a gated community. You know how weird it is to talk about residential segregation? So anyway, I show up at this book group, and they're really nice people. And they had a dinner, and they invited me to stay for dinner. And then afterwards, this man comes up to me and he says, "My grandfather was a Klansman." Just like that. And for the life of me, I couldn't figure out what to say. And like 3 days later, I figured it out. That I should have said, mine wasn't. Yes, sir, you had a question.
Kevin, has anybody offered you movie rights for this?
There was a point after the book came out, though if you have a deal, I'm up for it. Where it was optioned for a while, but nothing ever came of it, which I'm told is a very normal way that this operates. So it's available. Yes, sir.
Was the Talented 10 an actual group of people, or was it just a conceptualization in his mind?
Let me repeat that for people. It's a great question. The question is, was the Talented 10th, which is a term that I use a lot in the book, an actual group of people or a kind of concept? It was a concept that the great intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois created, the great intellectual and he's one of the great American intellectuals and snob, W.E.B. Du Bois, which he was, developed, basically said that the African American race should be led by the top 10% of its people, which oddly enough, W.E.B. Du Bois was pretty sure he was in. Actually, he was in the top 10% of anybody's population. He's a brilliant, brilliant man. Yeah, no, he's a brilliant, brilliant man. And I don't mean to belittle it, but you have to admit there is a certain snobbishness in that term. And so really the idea was that you're going to create this kind of intellectual and professional elite. And I use the term because I see Dr. Sweet as a classic example of someone working his way into that group, which is why I use it as a shorthand for kind of rising to the top of the profession. But it's a concept that comes from Du Bois. Yes, sir?
In regards to people asking you about why don't you say this was a Klan riot, do you have a ballpark figure Detroit in the 1920s of similar incidents that happened? Obviously,
lots.
They ended up in murder, but
yeah. No, there's lots. In fact, one of the things that I haven't mentioned, but I go into a good bit of detail in the book, is that Dr. Sweet, as I said, bought the house, made the deal in June of 1925. That summer, there's 3 or 4 incidents of mobs driving African Americans out of neighborhoods, mostly on the west side. In fact, they're all on the west side. There's another African American neighborhood, a middle class neighborhood on the west side of Detroit, and people started to cross out of that neighborhood into white neighborhoods, And those incidents were all around that neighborhood. It was over on near Tireman Avenue, if anyone knows the west side. And I actually went over to find those houses too, and most of those are now gone because the Jeffries Freeway took them out. So yes, this happened all the time. What really makes this story distinctive, as you said, is someone gets killed and Clarence Darrow shows up. These incidents happened all the time, and they happened throughout the 1920s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s. They were happening all the time in Detroit when African Americans broke across the color line. It's a very common thing. Just Clarence Darrow didn't show up.
You mentioned that circumstances change people. The system within which they're operating, they do terrible things.
That's right.
Immediately, Germany. Not all Germans were beasts.
That's right.
But they came.
That's right.
But I was thinking about the history of the Klan in the North. I thought was not necessarily focused entirely on blacks. It was anti-Catholic,
that's absolutely right.
Anti-Jew, and I was just thinking in terms of
that's absolutely
in Detroit,
right.
It was the perhaps increased southern migration of both black and white that took on the more black versus white manifestation.
No, you're absolutely right. And I'm just going to repeat it for people. The Klan of the 1920s, the one that we were just talking about, the Klan was anti-black, of course. I mean, that's kind of a foundation for the Klan. But this was a new Klan. It had been created really in the teens. And it started off, I mean, I'm not making this up. It started off basically as a movie spin-off. It came from Birth of a Nation. And then it became kind of, a thing to do. And the Klan was anti-black, but it was also anti-Semitic. It was anti-Catholic, and it was anti-immigrant. And in Michigan, its real great, strongest appeal was anti-Catholicism. Because Detroit, especially, was a very, very Catholic city. It was 50% of the city was Catholic. And so it made a huge appeal on the anti-Catholic front. Twice in the state of Michigan, they tried to outlaw parochial schools because you didn't want people going and being corrupted by the priests and nuns. And actually, I'm living proof of that. So yes, and one of the consequences of that, which I think is really important, is that then what it did politically in the city of Detroit is it pushed together groups that weren't natural allies. So one of the things that helps Frank Murphy in a political sense is that he's building a coalition that combines Jewish Americans, Catholic Americans, African Americans into a political coalition that's basically driven together by the Klan. Wasn't their intention, obviously, and that becomes it becomes the New Deal coalition. You want to understand where the New Deal comes from in the North, it really, I'm convinced, comes from the Ku Klux Klan. It pushes together groups in the North that are not natural allies by the hatred that is projected against them. Yes?
Do you think that the events were affected by the fact that they had bought more Catholic?
Yes, I do. I'm going to repeat that. It's a great question. Do I think that this incident was caused by the fact they helped to cause, by the fact they bought the brick house? Oh, yeah, sure. Because they bought the best house on the block. And so now it was the economics. I'm not trying to say that's it alone, but I also think that there was inherent in that, it's an affront. Not only did you buy the best house, move on to my block, you bought the best house. And by the way, though I don't think people knew this, they paid about 50% over market value for it. So yeah, from that perspective, and again, that's a critical point, from someone who knows nothing but sees these people moving in, yeah, this is an affront in all sorts of ways. I think we have one more? Yes, sir.
As you began this evening talking about the way that you used to teach civil rights, and after you wrote the book, could you tell us a little bit about how you now teach civil rights?
Okay. That's a great question. I think what you have to do is you have to understand that the civil rights movement in the United States, I think, my argument, is that there's a civil rights movement that starts immediately with emancipation. Now, I understand there was slave resistance prior to emancipation, but I think something fundamental changes with emancipation. I think you have to think of the civil rights movement in America as this enormously long stream. And what we think of as the civil rights movement is the rapids. It's that little stretch in there where all of a sudden the change starts to come really, really fast. Now, why I think this is important is that if you see this, history of civil rights is an incredibly long stream, then what you suddenly realize is how fiercely white America fought against it. That it didn't take 10 years to break down the Southern system of Jim Crow. It took almost 100 years to break that down. And that was about fundamental questions. That was about the most basic of American rights. That's the right to vote. That's the right of freedom of speech. And if you think about, and this is why I like to think this story is particularly important, at least for me, is particularly important. And if you're willing to acknowledge that we still live in a segregated society, and the remarkable thing to me is the degree to which white Americans, and I know, this could be a shock, I am white, the degree to which white Americans don't seem to notice it. You take a city, take segregation of American cities. They are almost completely segregated. The most segregated city in America, do you know what percentage in the most segregated city in America, according to the 2010 census, it's an official measurement of this, is Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And the way this is measured is what percentage of the metropolitan area's population, what percentage of their African American population would have to move to white neighborhoods in order to make that metropolitan area completely integrated. So if a metropolitan area gets a score on this measurement of 0, it's completely integrated already. If it gets a score of 100, it's completely segregated. Last time they did this was last year. The top city in that list, the most segregated city, as I said, is Milwaukee. On that scale, 0 to 100, Milwaukee's score, I think this is exactly right, was 82.5. That's apartheid. And we are living with that every day and thinking we have solved the race problem. So if you think of civil rights as a long stream, I think what's really critically important to recognize is that that stream's still going. Because we've made great progress. I'm not thinking at all, I'm not trying to argue at all, the United States is the same country it was in 1925. We have made enormous progress. We are a way better society than we were in 1925. The tricky part is acknowledging that we're not done yet. Thank you all so very much for your time.
Thank you, Professor Boyle. Thanks, Judge Whitbeck, for your moderating. And we'd like to thank you all for coming, and please do us a favor. In your program, there is a rip-out form, evaluation form, and we ask you to fill it out for 2 reasons. 1, your responses will help the Michigan Humanities Council forge better programs, but 2, our funders also like to get feedback so that they can fund us some more. So your work in filling that out in a few minutes will help us, and you can leave it with the staff as you exit. Thank you for coming. Question has been asked, will the author sign your book? And yes, he'll be pleased to at the far end of the room near the exit.
I saw you pick it up.
I expect you. I'm disappointed.
Yes. That's amazing.
Hey, you know what?